Thank you so much to all of you for being here, for the Design Studio for hosting, and for the many people who've contributed this evening, this event. It's truly an honor to be here sharing our work as an office. The setup that was just given, I think, is a really meaningful story. I think everyone has a story about a water body, whether it's the marshes of coastal Louisiana or the tributaries of the Christina or the Hudson River in New York that we're now working along. Water is this kind of driving force that people are drawn to. It's mesmerizing. But in many ways, in urban systems, we don't always see it or experience it in the same visceral way that has once occurred. And so what I'm hoping to kind of talk about tonight is both the work of SCAPE, landscape architecture. We're an urban design studio based in New York City. But also just our relationship and our evolving relationship with urban water systems. People have impacted urban water systems for centuries. We're seeing some of those impacts today, and we also have great relationships with urban water. And hopefully the work that I show tonight can help provoke new ideas and new responses around the urban water systems of the Tennessee River and the Chattanooga Creek that we're going to be looking at within a workshop tomorrow. So thank you for inviting me here to have this conversation. So as I mentioned, this is where I am from. I spend a majority of my time working at SCAPE in our office in New York City. I invite you all to kind of come by and say hello if you find yourself in New York. We are an urban design and landscape architecture practice, but we have a very interdisciplinary staff and kind of wonderfully dedicated group of people thinking about designing urban landscapes. This includes landscape architects, urban designers, planners, and horticulturalists, and a lot of people that kind of cross-pollinate or have degrees and experience in all of those different fields. Recently, our office came out with a book, which is called Tour to Urban Ecology, which really translates some of the goals of our practice into a methodology for thinking about the urban landscape, and water plays a huge role in that method. Some of the principles of our office are really about working to revive landscape systems, really uncovering functional landscape systems that in many cities and places have been buried or are kind of unknown. Forging connections between humans and non-humans in our urban environments. So on the right is a person dressed up like a horseshoe crab, and on the left is an actual horseshoe crab who is a resident of New York City living on the edges of Plum Beach. And so we don't always think about the wide host of species that use our urban water systems, but they are there, they have existed from prehistoric times, and we should be thinking about building and accommodating this wide set of needs. We develop work to generate functional ecosystems, not only landscapes that look green, but that have ecological benefits and performance embedded within them. We try very hard to embrace the physical reality of urban landscapes. It's kind of a trope in landscape architecture in particular that, we make things green, we make things beautiful. I've certainly done many Photoshop renderings with green roofs on every building extending far into the skyline. But the reality is a lot of our functional and diverse and ecologically rich urban landscapes are sometimes mucky looking or underwater or have different textures, sometimes smelly, especially as intertidal landscapes that we work in so much. And so we really try to embrace and translate and interpret the physical reality of functional ecosystems and what this means. Finally, we believe that urban ecology, which is a very important word for our practice, must involve people. It cannot be a practice that ignores people. People need to participate in making and crafting and stewarding urban landscape systems. And it's also about experimentation, that we don't have all the answers, that this is a relatively new field, and that our cities are places to begin to experiment with generating robust living ecosystems. And so I thought this evening it would be great to talk about 3 projects that SCAPE is advancing. They are all along water bodies, all at different scales. The first one is a stream, the second one is a creek, and the third one is a river. This third one is in progress. It's a very active project, giving you kind of a sneak peek into our working method. And they all span different parts of the country and address different issues. So the first one is called Town Branch Commons, and it's a project that's helping trace and reveal and improve the quality of a buried urban water system in Lexington, Kentucky. It's currently under construction, which is very exciting. The second one is called Public Sediment, and it's a proposal for how to reconnect one of the tributaries that lines the San Francisco Bay Area to its historic marshlands and adapt to sea level rise. And then the third project is a little bit closer to home here, and it's called the Chattahoochee Riverlands. And it's a project that we started only a couple of months ago with the Trust for Public Land and the City of Atlanta and the Atlanta Regional Commission and many, many other partners, thinking about how the metro Atlanta area can realign and embrace the large river system that moves in and around it, which is the Chattahoochee River. And so that's a very different scale of project. That's a 100-mile long planning corridor project. So kind of different way of thinking, but you'll see, I think there's a lot of like resonance between these projects and how we approach urban water systems. So, Town Branch. Town Branch is a very interesting project, and Lexington itself is a very interesting city. So you can see Lexington here on the map. Unlike a lot of major cities in North America, it is not founded along the banks of a large river like the Kentucky River. It's founded along the banks of a tiny, tiny stream that has kind of disappeared from the kind of consciousness and reading of the city today. Lexington has an urban growth boundary, which is quite visible in this image. You can see the kind of containment of the urban landscape and the preservation and investment in the rural bluegrass region, which is the kind of home of the iconic both bourbon country, but also iconic racehorses and white picket fences. This is the division between the rural growth area and the urban growth area, that kind of stark divide. And this project proposed for downtown Lexington, which is included in this square here, is called Town Branch Commons, and it's part of a larger trail and greenway, which is meant to really connect the rural and the urban and run along this buried water body of the Town Branch. So we were invited in 2012 to participate in a competition on how we might think about creating a greenway and creating an urban water landscape experience through the downtown. You can see how developed it is. This is about a 2.5-mile long stretch. And the competition brief said, hey, we have this amazing little stream system that once was the historic founding point of our city. It's been covered up, it's been buried, it's been turned into a culvert, actually 2 culverts, which are shown here on the page. But it's been kind of engineered beyond recognition. What can we do? It's also like 10 or 12 feet below ground, and it runs underneath one of our major transportation corridors. And so that was a challenge. That was an interesting challenge for our office. And we decided to pursue this competition and kind of develop a methodology for both tracing the path of the river, where it wasn't possible to daylight it within the city fabric because of its depth. Also develop a logic for improving water quality within that river or within that stream. One of the very interesting things about Town Branch, this small stream, is that the city of Lexington makes up its headwaters, and so all of the water that falls on the streets of downtown ultimately makes its way into this culvert or into this historic buried water body. And so there was a possibility of treating more of that water and making conditions downstream a little bit happier and healthier. But also at moments, we developed a logic for revealing the water itself and finding moments within the city fabric where it would be possible to pull back some of the streets, to pull back some of the urbanization, and create a meandering course for that stream to express itself and turn it into a park resource. And so we developed this competition plan, which you see here, which has been our kind of guiding document for many years advancing this project now, and thought about this kind of idea of revealing the river at certain moments, cleaning the river at other portions, carving out room for the river in parts of the more densely developed urban fabric, and also using the river as a connective element, particularly in the upper reaches. So the river really runs from the headwaters downstream and then continues on to the rural service area. I cannot figure out these, these buttons. But we also wanted to develop a really unique language that was based in the regional geology and topography to be a driver for this project. And we looked a lot at the bedrock of Lexington and became very inspired by how water moved through this region, using some of our site photographs and our kind of on-site experiences, realized that Lexington, one of the kind of rumors about the city and its geologic origins is that it has this limestone bedrock called karst, and the karst makes the grass grow greener than the bluegrass hills. The horses eat it, and it makes their bones stronger, and it filters the water and makes the bourbon taste better. So we're not actually sure if any of those things are true, but we kind of realized that this stone that like underlied the city kind of was really tied into like the culture of the place and the things that Lexington was known for. Also, we realized that karst hydrology is a very specific thing. In a kind of natural system, karst is a very porous type of bedrock. So a river or a stream running on top of it sometimes actually moves into the bedrock itself and creates giant sinkholes. And I think you have examples of that here as well. But we basically have a really interesting kind of hydrologic pattern where you have interrupted stream channels, swallets, and moments where the river will literally disappear and then reappear again, or the stream will disappear and reappear again because the ground is so porous and the stone is so porous below. And that became our kind of driving concept for Town Branch, of how we might actually reveal Town Branch in the urban fabric. We might truly reveal it at moments, but sometimes we might let it just slip underground, or it wasn't practical or possible to daylight it completely. How could the urban system reflect some of the qualities of the natural system of being able to move up and down below and within the water surface? And so these are images that we produced during that competition phase and shortly thereafter that are helping guide the way for a kind of larger fundraising project around the Town Branch Park, which is the moment where we can fully reveal the stream and bring it back into the fabric of the city. So if you're a basketball fan, you'll notice Rupp Arena in the background. If you're a landscape fan, you'll notice the Town Branch kind of revealed in the foreground. But we also kind of tied it into this larger greenway and connectivity project of where it wasn't completely possible to reveal the stream along the surface of the city, to actually trace the path and create an expanded public realm, shrink the section of the street, and add more space for pedestrians, add more space for tree planting, and add more space for water itself to move. And so this became a very exciting project for our office, and we won the competition, which is always great as a young office, and then we kind of immediately found out that there was only a small amount of funding available for a kind of master plan level effort, but no implementation funds. But we ended up working for many years with the city and a number of other partners, both private and public, to identify different funding sources to complete the project in different ways. And so the project did get a Tiger Grant a couple of years ago, which is funding the implementation of the entire streetscape component, which is under construction today. So it's an exciting moment, I think, right now because the project has been under development for so long. But we also had this kind of period of trying to figure out, we had a great competition plan, we had done a master plan and a feasibility study to make sure some of the things that we had proposed was possible, but the project was still a little bit off the radar and not kind of clued in. People didn't really know about the Town Branch. It was kind of this hidden, it's basically a culvert. And so we had this question of how do we get people excited about a culvert, which is a challenging question. But we developed this little project, this kind of mini project that we did in between before we had major implementation funding and after the competition, called the Town Branch Water Walk, which was a series of podcasts that were kind of done with local students at the University of Kentucky that all spoke about different points along the stream and different points along the buried culvert, and interviewed local ecologists, local hydrologists, water quality officials within the city, and developed this really great storybook of Town Branch stories over time and how the creek and the city evolved. We made an interactive map, but we also did walking tours of this landscape where you could actually listen to the podcasts and walk along the path of Town Branch. And so if anyone's visiting Lexington, I would recommend that you download our podcast series. It's highly entertaining. In one of them, you actually get swept through the drain and end up in the Town Branch culvert below the city. We have a lot of funny side effects and sound effects made by the students. But this became a really great kind of engagement and interpretation tool for this larger project that ultimately gained a lot of leverage and momentum in the community. We also started developing a really kind of stronger design language for the project, which is based upon this visual vocabulary of fences, of karst formations and patterns, and of these bedrock layers building up within the city. That's translated to a kind of toolkit of urban design solutions for creating paved areas for both pedestrians and bicyclists downtown. So these are just some of our design sketches looking at how we develop this kind of unique, kind of contemporary application of the karst stone wall that will help divide bicyclists and pedestrians in some of the higher traffic and faster moving pieces of the project. These kind of cheek walls that rise and fall with the grade that also helped shape and direct the flow of water as it moves into larger planting beds and spaces. And which ultimately kind of became this template which is being implemented today of this new streetscape that really reduces space for vehicles, because there was quite a lot of large lane widths in the downtown Lexington area, and creates a lot of space for pedestrians, for bicyclists, for tree planting, for root growth, which is very important, and also for water. And so these images show some of the work we did kind of aligning this system to meet the streets. You can see it's a kind of very, very vehicular dominated area today. The town branch runs right below here in its series of 2 culverts. So that kind of mystery of the creek and the system is very much missing today. But you can see some of the images we've created about this transformation, and these are kind of scaled appropriately to the actual proposal. These are not just competition images. And I think really represents a kind of turning point in recognizing this water body over time, expressing it at its surface, managing and treating water before it flows into the culvert system below, and really kind of creating a dynamic public space that celebrates the use of water, celebrates the capture and treatment of stormwater, and also celebrates the kind of seasonal nature of the karst hydrology system that sometimes has water and sometimes does not. It's a very cyclical and seasonal kind of presence. And so we're just very excited about this project. It's this 2.5-mile long stretch of the city, which is going to be transformed. And I hope that I can come back in a couple years and present the finished product. So kind of moving on to a different scale and a kind of different level of thinking, one of the things that we work on a lot in our office is this question of coastal edges and climate change adaptation. As a New Yorker, kind of living in the city during Hurricane Sandy, it was quite a kind of shock and realization that we needed to be thinking and planning very differently about our shorelines and about our coastal edges and their adaptation and ability to withstand and respond to climate change over time. And we worked on a large project in New York for many years and are still working on it. It's also under construction. SCAPE has a lot of projects under construction because we imagine these big things that kind of take decades to do. But that was a living oyster reef off the shore of Staten Island, and that was a kind of response to how we might think differently about responding to climate change. Instead of building walls, how can we invest in living systems that can grow and adapt and help protect us from some of the impacts of storms, but also help encourage other life, other forms of life. And so Public Sediment was a project that was developed with that same methodology, but for the West Coast, and looking at the very specific considerations and concerns of sea level rise in the Bay Area. It was developed with a really interdisciplinary and collaborative team, some of which is shown here, and also included many partners in the region. But it took this premise that the Baylands, the bay landscape of the San Francisco Bay Area, is really living infrastructure. And the water body itself is an infrastructure that we need to be investing in the same way that we invest in bridges or roadways. It really supports the region. It provides a lot of the nursery ground for much of the offshore fisheries resources. It provides clean water for the larger region. But it also is a cushion to the impacts of climate change in the Bay Area and can help buffer against threats of sea level rise and wave action over time. And so if we lose the baylands, which are the marshes and the mudflats that line the bay, we lose that protective cushion that helps buffer the city. We also realized that the San Francisco Bay Area was deeply dependent upon mud, which sounds funny, deeply dependent upon sediment. And this is because, I think I have a slide, we made the statement that sediment is the building block of resilience in the bay. This is why we called our team Public Sediment. And this is because sediment builds baylands, marshes and mudflats. They require sediment inflows to be able to both exist, but also especially to keep pace with rising sea levels. So the bay is tidally influenced, it's connected to the ocean, it's impacted by rising sea levels, and marshes can begin to accrete and build up and grow along with the pace of climate change if they have sediment supply and if you have a healthy system. But sediment is actually a scarce resource, and there's an issue of low sediment supply in the Bay Area in particular. And this low sediment supply is a very, very slow threat. It's a threat that's been building up since dam construction in the 50s. And it's also very invisible because it happens so slowly, people don't really think about the compounding impacts of low sediment supply. But we have channelized much of our free-flowing tributaries that once brought sediment down the hillsides in large storm events and annual floods. And we have also dammed most of the tributaries that feed the Bay Area in some way, which traps sediment upstream. So we've kind of decoupled the flows of water and sediment. And this is not just a problem in the San Francisco Bay Area, this is a problem in many large watersheds around the country. A lot of scientific partners are beginning to look at these questions of the impacts of low sediment supply in the Bay Area, but I don't think it's a kind of more like widely known or discussed feature. And the SFEI, the San Francisco Estuary Institute, has begun to do some studies looking at the amount of sediment that is coming from San Francisco Bay tributaries and the amount that is coming from the Sacramento and San Joaquin River Delta, and then comparing that to sediment needs in 2100 with 3 feet of sea level rise. And so the point of this graphic is that there's just a large discrepancy between the amount of sediment coming into the system, the amount of sediment that was historically available, and the amount of sediment that might be required to keep these systems alive and not completely drowned with sea level rise projections. And so we began to map a lot of this. This is San Francisco right here. This is the San Francisco Bay, North Bay, Central Bay, South Bay, and Sassoon. And these little blue lines are all the different local tributaries that feed the bay. And then these two larger blue lines that go off the page are the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers that also feed the bay, historically fed the bay with the most sediment, but have been very massively dammed for water supply and flood control projects. And so we looked at what might happen to the Bay Area, both with sea level rise, but also with low sediment supply. And we see this large transformation. So this is with 7 feet of sea level rise, and this is with 3 feet of sea level rise. I'll just go back. But we see this large transformation of all of these protective ecological assets, these bayland marshes and mudflats, from marsh to mudflat to open water. So we also see in pink a whole bunch of areas along the perimeter and fringe that are urban today that are at risk of being inundated. And so these areas line the bay. They include lots of parts of Napa and Sonoma. They include lots of parts of the edges of San Francisco, but also big parts of Palo Alto and Silicon Valley, some of these very wealthy and invested areas. And so there's a really kind of big question of what should happen here. How should we be thinking about protecting against sea level rise? But also how should we be thinking about protecting and investing in these natural assets, these living infrastructure assets? And so there's all kinds of statistics about this, but it's been projected that most of the marshes in the Bay Area could be damaged or destroyed by 2100 unless we do something now. So this very slowly moving problem is actually a really big problem. And then this is paired with urban levels of risk, that with 1.4 meters of sea level rise, thousands of thousands, hundreds of thousands of residents and critical infrastructure is also at risk. And so our proposal, I'm going to speed up a little bit, but really focused around linking these risks with kind of doable solutions that focus now on investing in ecological assets. And so we developed this concept of designing with sediment, really thinking about how to uncouple and unlock some of these sediment flows, but also making this larger conversation about this ecological resource of sediment a public conversation, so to make sediment public. To do this, we realized we had to kind of zoom out and look upstream, not only look at the water body itself, but look at the larger watershed. And we decided to choose, we looked at all the different tributaries that fed the bay with sediment, and we chose to focus on Alameda Creek as just one tributary because that seemed more manageable for a kind of competition time frame. So this is a map of the Alameda Creek watershed. It's kind of flattened, so you can see the bay area and the Alameda Creek watershed here. The Alameda Creek watershed is one of the largest suppliers of sediment from a local tributary that feeds the bay. But historically, it had a much bigger presence. It was a wide, meandering alluvial fan that fed the bay with water and sediment. It created a whole fringe of tidal wetlands at its edge, and this cone called the Niles Cone, which is the cone of the alluvial fan. It was locked in place over time with suburbanization, and so all of those little pink lines are little streets and are all developed. And then those big marshes at the bay's edge became turned into industrial salt ponds. So if you fly into San Francisco, you can often see these almost like psychedelic colored ponds, which are used as salt production facilities. That's like this part of our study area. So the creek was really locked in place. It was also channelized, so this creek was no longer a dynamic system that's able to overflow its banks. It's been locked in place. And the vulnerabilities that sea level rise and climate change presents make this condition even more extreme. So we have potential erosion at the edges of some of these levees along the perimeter of these salt ponds. We have subsidence behind in some of these zones because they've been cut off from those sediment-nourishing tides and currents of the creek. And then we actually have a lot of sediment buildup happening in the channel itself. So sediment that is actually moving downstream gets stuck in the channel. And you can see that condition here. So this is looking down the Niles Cone towards the bay in the distance. You can see how developed and urban it is as a place. It's the biggest suburb of the Bay Area. But we have sediment stuck in this channel, which has really been squished and treated as a kind of standard system, as is common with the Army Corps of Engineers. And sediment not making it all the way out to the bay, not making it out to these big tidal ponds, which are proposed to be restored into tidal wetlands, and not really feeding the system and creating this ecological buffer that could help buffer against the impacts of sea level rise. And so our project was really about looking at this larger channel, especially the lower portion of the channel, and figuring out how we could reconfigure the system it's not possible to go back to a historic period in time. Each one of those little homes probably cost $1 million if you've ever looked at San Francisco real estate prices. So we didn't really have the funds or the budget to relocate large swaths of urban area. But we were inspired by the past historic condition. This is the kind of process of leveization and suburban development that occurred. But also tried to understand just what was happening in the channel today. So it was not really designed to move sediment. And this is why my colleague, Gena, could walk across it, because it's been building up with sediment and becoming a very shallow, flat channel. It was also not designed for the passage of fish. So imagine being a fish trying to take your annual spawning migration upstream. It's quite challenging. And it was not necessarily designed to engage people. There's a great public path that runs along the perimeter, but people are not allowed in the channel to really experience this ecological resource today because it's viewed as a piece of flood control infrastructure. And so our proposal was really about transforming this channel and tweaking the channel and doing what we could to help move sediment downstream, to get sediment from the uplands, to move it through the channel where it was being stuck, and to get it to this large-scale restoration project of wetlands proposed at the bay's edge. So we really tried to design the system around sediment, people, and fish. How can people use this space better? How can we move sediment? And how can we aid the migration of fish? And so these are just some mappings and drawings. We worked with Alameda County Flood Control District to think about different ways of redesigning the profile of the channel itself. This is the profile of the channel. So you saw that image of Gena walking over, and you can see the very shallow water that exists along the edges. So we proposed to actually dredge the channel and vegetate it in a way that would stabilize the banks and encourage the formation of a deeper bankful channel, which would have more biodiverse edges, but also move more sediment downstream and perform more like the channel once historically looked like in cross-section. So this is a kind of primary piece of our proposal, this kind of transformation of the channel into something that was stabilized with vegetation and had a multi-stage channel embedded within it. We also looked for opportunities to enable fish passage and refuge. There were initiatives underway to install fish ladders along the channel, and we looked for places to create more shelter and kind of migration rest stops and habitat for fish along the way. So the fish species that we were targeting were steelhead, which are salmonid species. They migrate upstream to spawn. But today, I think they only find it used to be one of the largest steelhead spawning streams in the Bay Area, and I think every year now they find 1 or 2 fish at the bottom of they call it the Bart Weir, that big barrier in the river, trying to make it over, because it's such a difficult, one of the fish experts on the team calls it a migration gauntlet for fish. We've kind of designed that habitat and that migration space out of the system. So we were working very actively to bring that back in. We were also working very actively to enhance habitat for less charismatic, equally interesting species, like the Pacific lamprey, which, this is kind of what I said. Not all the habitat images are like green and fuzzy. Sometimes they're shocking and terrifying when a lamprey attaches to your arm. But, our natural world is made up of a bunch of amazing creatures that we should be thinking about. And so this is also a migratory species that would be enhanced with this design proposal. And then finally, we thought about a channel that could really be part of the public realm. One of the challenges of the creek today is that it divides communities of different incomes, community of different ethnicities, and it's simply just hard to cross. It's an infrastructure that's designed for flood control management, but not necessarily for pedestrian action. And so we worked a lot with different community members to understand how they maybe could or would use the space if there are more connections and more places to linger along the river. One of our favorite events was called a creek crawl, where we held a kind of walking educational session along the creek with different local experts kind of talking at different stations about Alameda Creek. And it was really interesting because while many people used the path, people weren't really aware of the larger role that the creek potentially played in the larger resilience of the bay and their wider community. And so we developed these 4 concepts of how can we build a constituency around the creek and how can we make space for people, literally make space. And we developed this concept of mud rooms and flood rooms, which make space for people in different ways. Mud rooms were these kind of smaller scale pockets of levee extension that would help shape the flow of the reconstructed channel. You can see some of our river training, like baffles and willow plantings here, or vegetative plantings here, that would sculpt the edge of the mudroom, and it would simply be a place to sit and to linger. There could be outdoor classrooms, places to engage the creek. We developed the concept of flood rooms, where possible, actually pulling the levee back. These spaces are few and far between, but if we can do that, you can create these migration resting areas for fish along the passage. This concept of a terrace trail, actually just simply allowing people into the dry riverbed during the dry season when there is not a risk of flooding, and creating a single path that would be just very simply managed, that would allow people to get down to that immersive landscape adjacent to the water. One of people's biggest complaints about the waterway was that there was not enough water in the waterway. It's also the primary drinking supply for the region, so there's a little bit of a conflict there. California doesn't have a lot of water, so we couldn't really propose releasing more water into the stream. That's a long and contentious process, so we thought about trying to get people closer to the water so they could see more of it, and maybe they would value their drinking water resources in a different way over time. And we also thought about seasonal bridges and crossings that could be repurposed with existing infrastructure, but create these moments for crossing for these wider communities. And so this proposal, which really works inside the levees, is really about unlocking Alameda Creek for sediment, people, and fish. These are just some of the renderings and images that we did to kind of illustrate the potential of this project to community members and to potential funders and political officials. And we are very actively working on identifying funding sources for this work, both to make the creek a better place, to improve fish migration through and to create spaces for people, but also to move sediment downstream to help the creek perform more like a natural system and more like it once performed in the past. You can see it's a relatively modest amount of sediment. It would move about 5,000 cubic yards of sediment a year. But what's really important is that this slow feed of sediment annually is something that can't simply be replaced by a dump truck or a bulldozer. This slow feed of sediment is that kind of trickle that will allow these marshes to accrete and adapt over time. So that's a very important ecosystem function. But one of the other big challenges was that you can do all of this work upstream, but we still have this condition downstream where even if we moved more sediment down the water body, it might not actually make it to the wetland restoration project because there is a levee along the edges of the creek all the way down. And so we worked with many partners to identify a location for a proposed breach to make sure that sediment can move through. It looks very simple. It was actually a very complicated process that involves a lot of flood modeling to make sure you're not breaching at a moment that's going to flood any communities. And we had to propose other types of infrastructure improvements to even enable that breach. But that's being worked into the plan for the restoration project today, so it's very exciting. And this is a kind of final vision of some of those creek crossing moments down by the bay and this reconnected tributary that would be feeding the wetland system adjacent to it. And so I think this is an example of a project, this Unlock Alameda Creek, part of this public sediment proposal, which really shows the value and need, I think, when thinking about ecological systems, not only to think about what's in the backyard or what's in the urban area, but really kind of consider the greater system itself, that what you do upstream has impacts downstream. That's really what the Bay Area is facing, these longer term implications of decisions about dam construction and channel construction that were made 70, 80, 60 years ago, and being able to play out today. And so this has really made us think differently about decisions that we make along water bodies today, and they're both upstream and downstream impacts. But it's a very exciting proposal, and a little piece of it, which I didn't even talk about, which is called the gravel beach and berm. It's part of the infrastructure required to actually create the breach and this larger wetland restoration. This was just funded for a pilot installation with a NOAA coastal adaptation grant. So we're still looking for like $30 to $50 million to do this larger project, but we have a small grant to advance this piece, and we're very hopeful and confident that these will lead to bigger things over time. And then I think to close, it would be nice to kind of talk about a water body that's a little bit more local and some progress that we're working on with a project not so far away, the Chattahoochee River study, a greenway study within Metro Atlanta area. This is a much bigger project, and it's really about bringing people to the river. The Chattahoochee River is an incredible water body and system, and it's been protected, parts of it have been protected by great legislation that was set up in the 70s. But it's not necessarily on the mental map, even though it is this really big, beautiful waterway. Many people don't know about it. People might have tubed down it or crossed over it in a bridge, but it's not a very accessible waterway for Metro Atlanta, yet it runs right through the metro region. And so our office is working with many partners on a 100-mile-long study of the Chattahoochee. So it's a totally mind-blowing scale to be working at. We tried to do a driving tour of the river, and it took us like 5.5 days just to access the river at different points, because there's no easy way to get along it today. But this shows, this is Atlanta with the big loop of highways that probably everyone recognizes around it. This is the Metro Atlanta area. And our study area starts at Buford Dam and goes down to Chattahoochee Bend State Park here. And so we're not only looking at the river, this little black dotted line is our technical study area, but we're also looking at all the cities and towns along it and all the tributaries that feed into it as well. And so we have a really great, incredible team on the project and a great client team. It's a kind of multi-headed client team with the Atlanta Regional Commission, the Trust for Public Land, Cobb County, and the City of Atlanta, all coming together to advance this critical study. And we have a great design team collaborating to think about where this greenway along 100 miles of river corridor might go, what impacts it might have, what towns it might connect to, what ecological resources it might tap into, how it might inspire stewardship and management of this incredible landscape over time. And so as a kind of starting point for that, I thought I would just share some of our working research. So I have no greenway to reveal tonight. That would be kind of a shame for all the people that have been working on the project if we gave you the sneak peek of the greenway, but we don't even have one, so I can't do that. But we've been doing a huge amount of outreach and communication with people living along the Chattahoochee River, and also stakeholder organizations who have been invested in the Chattahoochee River for decades, if not generations. There's been an enormous amount of work and effort in keeping this a healthy water body. And so one of our first bits of work has really been to kind of map the evolution of the river over time. And so that's what this kind of next series of slides, and I'm going to just end on this evening, kind of speaks to, is like how the city of Atlanta and its expanding metro region has really evolved and grown along with the river, and what it brings up as a kind of future potential. So just for orientation, all of these maps are at the same scale. This is the kind of core of downtown Atlanta. This is the larger metro Atlanta area. And this is the Chattahoochee, our 100-mile-long stretch. And this is the watershed that actually feeds the Chattahoochee and many of the primary tributaries that feed in. And so we started by looking like way back at kind of pre-colonization, when the river was really this way of life. The Chattahoochee runs along a fault line. That's kind of one of the reasons it's a little bit straighter than other water bodies in the area. So you can see the fault line and the alignment of the river. One of our favorite things about the Chattahoochee is it has this really incredible series of shoal complexes, moments where the stone and that kind of fault line actually emerges in the water and creates great places for fishing, for hanging out, for getting your toes wet, for getting into the water, and really expressing the geology of the region. And so we've been trying to think and plan the project around these different shoal systems as kind of critical cultural and ecological spaces. Historically, the entire Chattahoochee River, this portion of it, was a warm water fishery with native species like shoal bass, migrating and using the river corridor in different ways for spawning and reproduction over time. Past populations of indigenous peoples actually made small structures in the river, like these small fishing weirs, to harvest those fish resources. And so all of these things kind of combined to kind of create this river really as a clustering point, and the river as a way of life that was highly forested and really was a very kind of ecologically rich experience. In the 1800s, the 1850s, the river became the source of industry, as many rivers in the region did. Paper and cotton mills emerging on its surface, the relics of which are visible today, and we're trying to tie into the Greenway Plan. Ferry crossings, these critical places of crossing of the river, are actually points of highway crossing today. But you can see there were many, many of them because the river was a barrier to movement, and there were lots of small boats that helped ferry you across. Many of these ferry crossings were also associated with these shoal moments, these kind of shallower moments in the river itself. The river was also kind of part of this history of forced relocation of indigenous people. With the removal of a population, the establishment of a new industrial population emerged. New towns and cities like Roswell and Campbellton were kind of created with that loss. But many of these places, especially the founding of Atlanta itself, the terminus of the Western Atlantic Railroad, kind of crossed the river along some of these historic Native American trails and early rail systems. And so some of these early bridges that really established the urban vitality of this region that we know today are actually still evident and present along the river corridor. So these are important cultural landmarks. The next era of the river, when the river was a source of industry, is really the 1850s to 1900s, when the river becomes actual barrier to movement. The world kind of speeds up and moves past the pace of the river. The rail network massively expands, so we saw the terminus and kind of mile zero for the city of Atlanta, and that one rail spur. Multiple rail spurs emerged and kind of developed, and now those lead and align with many of the major development corridors of the city. There are many crossing points. The river became something, instead of a destination, it became something to cross and something to move over. The slavery and agricultural economy also expanded with the conversion of much of the cropland and forest land to the cotton industry, which was a material moved by rail. And the river was also a barrier to movement during the Civil War. It was actually a kind of defensive barrier that was used by the Southern forces to help protect the invasion of the city of Atlanta. And some of those relics, some of the structures that were built at that time, stockades and trenches, which are today all forested, are still very much part of this landscape and visible historic resources. And so while there was this moment of the river really being a barrier, it was also still, in a smaller scale way, a community asset and used in this era as a site of baptism and religious and cultural practice along its shores. In the 1900s and 1950s, the river really became a regional utility, and so this is a very different application and use of the water body. It went from fish weirs to much larger dam structures, like the dams at Morgan Falls, which was built in 1904, still visible today. The Morgan Falls dams created the power network for the streetcar system of Atlanta, so there's a very direct relationship between the water flowing from north to south and spilling over the Morgan Falls Dam and the expanding streetcar network of the city of Atlanta. It also became the source of Atlanta's water supply intake. We started pulling water from the city. We also started pushing wastewater into the river itself, the creation of the combined sewer system. And then the era really ends with the construction in the 1950s of the Beaufort Dam, which is the large-scale dam system that creates the Lake Lanier Reservoir behind, which begins a much larger-scale power generation for the expanding metro Atlanta area. And so in this era, we really see massive urban growth, but also more segregated growth beginning to play out within the city fabric of different races beginning to colonize different areas. And it sets up this era of the river, which I think is maybe a low point in the history in terms of environmental quality, the 1950s and 1970s, where the river becomes a kind of forgotten and neglected resource. And this is at the same time that the Atlanta metro area is massively expanding, enabled by growth in transportation. So previously, one of the primary methods of navigation and transportation in the area was the rail network with the 1950s footprint. Came the expansion of the interstate system in metro Atlanta, the corridors of I-20, 285, 75, all the roads that we know and use today to navigate what I think is the completely unintelligible network of Atlanta. As a New Yorker, I'm like, where's the grid? There's no grid. I don't know what to do. But we see this massive highway network beginning to expand. This is mostly how people experience the river today, crossing over it on a daily basis along highway bridges. It really enables metro Atlanta growth, and though there's a lot of efforts on the part of city and regional planning to contain and direct this growth, I think you'll see from these slides, a series of slides from 1950 to 1970 to 1990 to 2000 and through today, that there has been just this huge kind of population explosion and development explosion that has happened in and around the river corridor. It's happened within the watershed. But it's also just really kind of interesting. You know, I think it's an environmental issue, obviously, that kind of level of suburbanization and development within the watershed. But it's also interesting that the river itself is so close to the core of the city and is this kind of hidden and underutilized river, so close to so many people. We also see the expansion of the transportation system, and we see a lot of the negative water quality impacts in terms of impaired streams and tributaries that feed the river today. The 70s also spurred this kind of re-engagement with the river at the end with activities like Shoot the Hooch, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with in the room, but brought kind of different eyes back to the river and made people think about the river differently in terms of it being a recreational resource, like trout fishermen, for example. And so this kind of next decade of the 70s to 2000s really is a great moment in the river's history because it catalyzed and spurred activism and regionalism and kind of stewardship around the river. Jimmy Carter kayaked the river and was kind of there for the foundings of Friends of the River, which became Chattahoochee Riverkeeper, and has been a huge environmental steward and protector of the river over time. The kind of deteriorated conditions, much like the kind of trash images that were shown earlier today, helped spur this kind of desire to do regional planning along the river, and the Chattahoochee River Corridor Study emerged, which led to legislation in the 1970s called the Metropolitan River Protection Act, which, now that we've seen the scale of development around, you can kind of contextualize, but protected a buffer, created land use controls and development restrictions around a 2,000-foot buffer along both sides of the river. So a very, very critical piece of legislation in maintaining the buffer zone along the water, MRPA. Also at this time, the Chattahoochee River National Recreation Area was established, creating park resources along many, many stretches of the northern parts of our study area, and created places for people to come use the water as an asset, created opportunities for citizen science and science to monitor and look at the water quality of the river itself. And the region began to make better decisions about investing in water and wastewater management systems that kept combined sewage out of the water body. And so today, and where this project is kind of landing, we're in this really interesting moment of the 2000s to the present, where the river is really in recovery. It is still an impaired system in many ways, but depending upon what metrics you're looking at. But it is also a beloved system. Water quality is better than it's been in 100 years. People are beginning to use the banks of the river itself for multiple activities. There are many water quality access or water access points along the river corridor. You can see there's not as many in the south, and this is something we really want to think about in our river plan, how to create more periodic moments of water access that more equitably distribute access to the resource to populations that need it most. There's an emerging network of parks, both old and new, like the new park being Chattahoochee Bend State Park, the southern point of the study area, that offer these opportunities to connect. And we have this really interesting cosmopolitan ecology today of the warm water fishery I mentioned still existing and has a lot of potential for restoration in the southern parts of the study area. But north of Atlanta, this cold water trout fishing, both economy and ecology, which is not native to the region, but created from the release structures at the Buford Dam, releasing cold water from the bottom of the dam, which has been actually enabled a sustainable population of brown trout to live and thrive and reproduce without stocking assistance in the northern part of the area. So it's a just pretty interesting ecological system, all of these different things happening at once. And even while we've seen the kind of pace of growth that has occurred over the last 70 years, the Atlanta metro area continues to grow. So our plan or our Greenway proposal, I think, has the potential to influence and suggest maybe more responsible methods of water management and growth along the river corridor. It's increasing in diversity, so a lot of that segregation that has historically occurred in the past is beginning to blend out, and diversity of many of the Atlanta suburbs are beginning to increase. And so a key piece of this study is really kind of incorporating social equity in planning and make sure that public access improvements are really serving populations that have had limited or underserved access in the past. And so a great example of this is our partner Walt from the Trust for Public Land, leading a tour with community members of the Proctor Creek watershed, a project in a kind of historically underserved neighborhood that's recently provided access along the creek to the river itself. So we want to tap into and build along a lot of these great projects. And then what's also very interesting, I think, also happening here in Chattanooga is that in the last 20 or 30 years, there really has been a resurgence in interest around trail planning and connectivity. And so there are all these amazing projects like the Beltline or Gwinnett Trail or the Silver Comet Trail that are happening around the region and beginning to tie into the larger river. And I think set up the Chattahoochee Greenway as this kind of great opportunity in time for the legacy of the river as being this moment to reconnect with the river. It's time for the Metro Atlanta region to really understand the ecological resource that exists, invest in it, and use it as an asset for the many people that live along its banks. So I'm going to end there with that kind of large-scale plan and study. As I said, we have not done the full project yet, but I really hope if it's a region that you're interested in or a water body that you're interested in, we're going to be having a couple of events around the planning of the project that are open to the public. I think in June we're having a river ramble, and we're going to be holding an event along the banks of the Chattahoochee, so I invite you all to that. It'll be posted on our website. But hopefully this gives you just like some insight into how we think about urban water systems, how we plan for them at different scales, and the many opportunities that exist both here in Chattanooga and beyond. So thank you.